Good morning or good day for those of you who are joining us from the UK or Europe. My name is Kimberly and I'm with Silo Compliance System and the host of AML Compliance Gray Matters. This is a webinar series that we present, and we usually have some esteemed guests. Today our guest is Paul Coleman. Welcome, Paul. How are you?
Good morning. I'm fine. Thank you. Looking forward to this opportunity, Kimberly. Thank you.
Yes. So, Paul, we're going to have a few housekeeping slides to start, just so people can get started. So our housekeeping is, this is not legal advice, just for those, sorry, I don't know why my screen's not, there it goes, it's switching over now. There will be certificates to our live attendees only. Again, it's not legal advice. We anticipate today's topic to take us about an hour. Now, for those of you who know Paul and I, we could probably talk about this for a good half a day, but I will try and limit it to for about an hour. I do have two handouts for those of you who are looking for some information. One handout is by the Cayman Islands Monetary Authority, and it's some information and guidance on submitting SARs for those of you who are MLROs. And then there's some information on Silo, our system. We will take some questions at the end as well, so feel free to kind of get familiar with the question box, and we'll take your questions, of course, and I'll be talking to Paul as well and asking him some questions during the process. I do have some polling questions to start with, just to kind of get you engaged and ask you some information so we understand who's listening in. The first question I have is, are you an MLRO? And so if you don't mind just taking a few moments and answering these questions. Looks like we have a good crowd of MLROs. It's wonderful. Give this just a couple more seconds. All right, almost half of you are MLROs. I'm going to go ahead and show you the responses. So if you can see that screen, so we're showing 41% are MLROs, 30% are not, 10% are not, but you directly manage MLROs, and 13% you anticipate becoming an MLRO. So welcome. And another question we have for you is, does your company provide, or does the MLRO of your company provide periodic reports to senior management? So that would be your board of directors or any kind of risk committees, management committees. And I'm kind of asking you if you can kind of tell us, are you giving detailed reports? Are you giving a report just on numbers? All right. Few more seconds. Looks like about 50% of you just report on numbers filed with no details. All right, we're going to close this one up. And that's the result. So 23% say yes, they do provide a detailed report, complete with names. 47% just a report on numbers. And 19% no reporting provided, 11% unsure. I think that is it for, oh, this is one more question, and it's regarding the SAR forms that you submit. And just as just a little bit of history, I used to be an MLRO myself. I was in London, and I can remember the SAR form that I was required to submit to our FIU was very restrictive in the data, a lot of drop-down boxes, and I found it personally difficult to submit. I was actually just looking at the Cayman Islands SAR report this morning, and I thought if I'd had something like that, it would have been a lot easier for me. Versus the one I had to file in the UK. All right, so it looks like we're getting a good half of you are saying yes, you think your SAR form is fit for purpose, 15% no, 8% are saying no specific form, 24% unsure. So I'll let you see those results as well. Okay. All right, so I'm going to let you get started. Paul, how about you taking a few moments and just kind of explain your background for those who aren't familiar with you and your experience. So please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Good day, everybody. I think it's better to say good day because it'll be afternoon for soon.
Absolutely.
Yeah, welcome. My name is Paul Coleman. I work as a consultant in the field of anti-money laundering. I go back quite a few years as to, I sort of had three careers. If I said, I joined a bank in the early days when banks were branches, and every branch did the same thing. They all had their own management and lending team and such like. So I joined in the old-fashioned bank. I worked with that for a long time. Now in banking, in those early days, what used to happen, you had very little control over your career. You just literally just waited for the phone to ring for your next assignment. I mean, through my manager at the time, I was a junior manager at the time, and they said, "Would you like to go and work in London as an internal auditor?" Well, yes, I did. That was quite, well, I have to say, quite a sort of brave step. As a man from, those of you who know the northeast of England will know that we regard ourselves as well, very sort of keep together. Anyway, I went to London. I had no idea what internal audit was about. My first day, and then this is a true story, they told me they were presenting a report to a branch, and I sat there listening as the inspector was presenting the report, and there was an argument. And I never ever believed that anybody would argue with an auditor. Little did I know at that time, but now I know slightly different. But quite frankly, in those days, yes, and it should be now even more so. It's a two-way discussion. Believe it or not, the wording, I'm from head office and I'm here to help, is intentional. But anyway, so then that was what brought me to the Caribbean. I'm based in Turks and Caicos, and it brought me to the Caribbean. I was a resident inspector for Barclays Bank in the Bahamas. I eventually moved around to Barbados, and then I came to Turks and Caicos for a while in the retail bank there. When that became First Caribbean, as those of you in the Caribbean will know that Barclays and CIBC merged into First Caribbean. I was, well, all the expatriate workers were sent home, and I was faced with early retirement, but I wanted to stay in Turks and Caicos. So hence I became a regulator. That was the only real job I was going to get. And I was tasked with setting up a supervisory position, a supervisory team for what we call, as many of you will know, DNFBPs, or they're the non-bank financial businesses. Then my role was broadened until we got all the banks and money service businesses and such like. So here I am, and then I decided to become a consultant, doing quite a lot of the same things, talking with businesses, financial businesses and individuals, and just working the way through the regulations and such like. So here I am in this opportunity. One of the things that has cropped up is all about the role of the money laundering reporting officer and where they fit. Should I just explain that a little bit, Kimberly?
Please do, absolutely.
If we think about, what we have to think about first of all is in anti-money laundering in the financial business sector is, why are we doing this? And the real reason why we're doing this, why we're asked to get due diligence, why we're asked to monitor expected all this, is so that we can provide law enforcement with meaningful information that helps them look at crime and helps them solve crime. The predicament is that it's reported very much that there's only, say, 1% of crimes are solved by the reporting of a suspicious activity. That's how it's reported. I must say that seems a very small number, but what I would say, 1%, it's not that it's not going to be 98% wrong. It's not going to be that 100% help to solve the crime. So we have that scenario that, and then we say to ourselves, well, the financial business, the private sector fits into this whole countrywide AML regime. It starts off Well, it starts off at the very beginning with, we're familiar with the Financial Action Task Force that sets the standards. They set the standards for the countries to adopt. And that's why they're called recommendations. The country has to fit the recommendations into its own legal environment, but they're expected to comply. Then we have the private sector, which we're mainly talking to here, I'm sure. Private sector is interacting with the customer, interacting with the client. And then we have, in that whole AML regime, then we have a reporting officer, when you a reporting authority that you send the SARs to, suspicious activity reports. They look at it, they hand it to law enforcement. Law enforcement, if they think there's a case, they hand it to the what in my country is called the Director of Public Prosecutions, and then they prosecute in the courts. And the courts have a role, the judiciary has a role to understand that. And then the final thing, of course, is that, which is the seed corn of why there is anti-money laundering, is to take the proceeds of the ill-gotten gains from that person that upon conviction, and they grab hold of his assets that he's got, the house, the investments, etc., right, like that. So it's all that. But if you think we're put ourselves in the position of the private sector, we are the starting point to get that. And the point about just to sort of square the circle, the criminal is at his most vulnerable when he has to tell a story to the financial business, when he wants to do what he wants to do with the money that he's got, the illicit funds. And of course, what are they doing? I mean, a lot of us will know about the integration stage, which is the final stage. They want to buy the big house. They want to buy the big house on the beach, the big car, you name it. But they've got to talk to somebody, and they've got to explain where the wealth is coming from. And this is where we come in the private sector.
Okay, I have a quick question for you. So because of the 1% you're saying is effective for the law enforcement, are you saying there's too many? Do you think, in your opinion, is it too many SARs being filed, or that the SARs that are being filed are just inadequate? Or is it that the 1%, maybe that data is kind of skewed, and it's not just the fact that only 1%, that was just the final SAR that was filed on a particular individual that maybe helped complete a bigger picture? And what's your opinion of the SAR quality, I should
Well,
ask?
Kimberly, this is the really the whole idea of when I came up with this, about how effective is the MLRO. And of course, the other way around, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, for those that 10% who have supervisory responsibilities over an MLRO, are they doing the right things? Because the issue is, yes, we don't know fully. What we do know is that FinCEN, which is the reporting authority in the United States, the UK FIU, Financial Intelligence Unit, is the reporting officer in a reporting authority in the UK, for two examples, and all countries will have their own equivalents. They tell us constantly that SARs are useful to them. They are, very, very useful. They provide a lot of information. The key is, from my perspective, looking at it from a regulator's point of view, we really, there was a reluctance and a feeling that nobody else should know exactly what the SAR, the MLRO is reporting, how they've come to their conclusion. So in this chain that I talk about is, where's the blockage that's only getting to 1%? Is that realistic? As you quite rightly said, Kimberly, that is it a quality? Is it there's just not enough monitoring? There's a lot to look at that jigsaw that say, well, why is that 1%? Is it realistic? The point about being realistic is not really the key. Is how do we know, and how confident is the MLRO to make that decision to report? It's a judgment call, and I'll talk more about that as we go along, Kimberly. But they are required to report, but they have to make a judgment call.
Right. So the 1% is kind of, that's the problem, or we're assessing if it's the problem. And then of course the why is only the 1%. Can we get that increased? How can we get that 1% to go up so that more SARs are effective for law enforcement. And so let's look at, so what we kind of want to explore today, if I understand you correctly, is maybe figuring out, is the MLRO role being effective? Is the MLRO, the money laundering reporting officer, are they effective? Are they filing adequate? And then I guess the other question is that the responsibility of senior management to look at their money laundering reporting officer and their processes? Is that
Right,
correct?
and absolutely. And you say, is it the responsibility of senior management? Yes, it is. I mean,
Okay.
because that person, that MLRO, is an employee of the organization, and no single employee should work on their own without any form of supervision whatsoever. And the confusion begins because the legislation in many countries, and probably almost all of them, if not all of them, will say that the MLRO is the sole decision maker for the ability to file a suspicious activity report to the FIU, FIA, right? Now,
Right.
and that's fine. That's that independence that they talk about. They've got to have sufficient knowledge, sufficient stature within the organization to be able to make that decision. And that's a fact. But that doesn't mean to say that they should not be supervised. And it was encouraging to see that in one of the poll questions, Kimberly, that there quite a lot of businesses do give reports to the board or senior management about activity. But in isolation, if there's none, what does that mean? Does it mean that that there are all the clients are good, which is no transactions are unusual? Does it mean that you're just not doing the monitoring correctly, or does it mean that the MLRO is not making sound judgments, critical judgments enough? And this is what you've got to find out. This is not to say, that you should have 20 SARs in a month or whatever. No, you should be able to know, how does the process work? And that's supervision. And this is the point that I was trying to make. We're up against a situation of this fear of tipping off if information is given elsewhere. And tipping off is an offence, but it's an individual offence. So if somebody in the course of their duty tips off, it could be the teller in the bank. It could be when they've sent an own internal suspicious activity report. It could be the MLRO itself, or it could be management. But there's a reluctance. So I refer to it slightly as it's the black hole of this process of monitoring and reporting our key objective, which is to get information of good quality into the hands of law enforcement.
Okay. Now, those who commented that in the polling question that they were reporting to senior management all of the, including details such as the names of the clients or the customers. As a regulator, I mean, do you find that risky, or do you find that perfectly acceptable for senior management to receive that information?
Well, to be quite frank, the names don't really prove a great deal. Because what the senior management, through the benefit of his compliance officer or internal audit, wants to know is the process and the controls and the ability of the MLRO sound. And as in any auditing or compliance review process, it's not about one single transaction. That when you find, that doesn't make, that doesn't say that everything's bad. I mean, if you've got to review them, and really, if you're talking about somebody reviewing suspicious activity reporting process, it needs to be somebody senior. It should not be the junior auditor, and just, it needs to be handled carefully, because this information is very, it's very confidential. I mean, all it is a suspicion. But there's a whole point about looking at cases and seeing, is there a process that is happening that is sound exactly the same way as, is there a process in customer due diligence that takes you through step by step to complete all the information you need? And yes, things will happen. A mistake will occur, but that doesn't mean the whole process is falling apart. But if 50 mistakes are occurring, 50 poor decisions are quite clearly made, the name doesn't matter, but the process hasn't been applied.
Okay. And I guess, also the management can be looking at, for instance, like, when the internal SAR was filed and then how long it took to go through the process and what the process was, what was done in that investigation, and if there were any blocks that inhibited the MLRO from doing a full investigation of the internal SAR.
Right. Well, yeah. I mean, the first point, of course, is that is the fear that many people have on the independence of an MLRO. That the MLRO is not sure. He goes to talk to the manager, which is not unreasonable to get information. But the manager said, "Oh, wait a minute. I know him. He's not laundering money. That's not what you want to hear, because as an MLRO, you've got that responsibility of it. And if you fail to report when all the facts are unraveled, and you can see all these red flags, all this lack of information, refusal to give you information, is sufficient to put it in the hands of the FIU. And when I say FIU, let's remember that FIU is sort of interchangeable. Some businesses have their own FIU department. When I say FIU, right, this is the countrywide body. So that's the interference. But yeah, so at that stage, right, I think I've probably covered that point.
Okay, all right. So you were kind of talking a little bit about, so it's just 20 minutes past the hour. You were talking a little bit about interference and also just the independence. And you don't see, as a regulator and auditor, you don't see a problem with the others within the organization who could unduly influence the MLRO or for not filing. I mean, you talked in our practice yesterday, we were talking a little bit about bias as well. I mean, did you want to mention that to the audience?
Yes, I will. Yeah, there's sort of three areas where I think the decisioning could be impacted. One of which is for the MLRO, and this is, well, probably every MLRO on the call here would probably give themselves an answer here. How well have you been trained, particularly as a role of MLRO, not just an awareness of general awareness of money laundering in itself, but it's, are you really well trained? Because if you're not well trained, that is, well, you're not on the starting blocks really if you're not well trained. But then the next vulnerability that the MLRO has, where they could be, is coercion or bribery. And we all know in the financial sector that when we recruit people, we go through a whole process to make sure that they're of good standing and not likely, no police record, such and such. So you're not, liable to be put in a position where you could be coerced. And there's willful blindness where people, just are not bothered. Now, bias and I'd say not bothered. I mean, I'm afraid to say it does happen. I mean, I can't imagine anybody here who's, made the effort to come on this call would be in that not bothered category. But, life is life. But the interesting one is the bias, because I came across this, and the more I thought about it, and it's a topic on its own, but bias is about this preconceived ideas, and that so much of bias is embedded in us as a child. We know how much we learn from our parents, what's good and what's bad, and we can think about people that there's bias around sport, which football team do you support, and that you have no time for the other one. Religion it can generate a bias, and let me give you a story which is not dead on the suspicious activity reporting, but I was instrumental in setting up the process and the controls around the non-profit organizations in Turks and Caicos. And there was a big pushback that said, why are you asking churches? What makes you think they're going to be doing anything bad? And the answer is, and I say this just factually, not without not without any of my own bias, but I said, well, yeah, we know we don't know what we don't know, and we start off with that we know the churches, we know the big ones, Anglican Church, and Catholic Church, and that sort of thing. And I said in one presentation I had to do, what would you do in this country if there was a Muslim church? When you think of the outcry, unjustified, and I would hesitate, I strongly say that, the outcry against Muslims after 9/11. Now, you know, so you don't know, but you can't put these people in boxes and just assume everybody's like that. And we also have, you know, small communities where everybody knows, you know. I once had an experience as an MLRO where somebody was opening an account and I asked, we haven't got much information. And the person who was doing the opening the account, well, everybody knows he has money. This is a small place. Everybody knows. Well, the big question is, well, where did it come from? You know, yes,
right. How did he get that money? Yeah.
So you can't just typecast him and say, well, he's wealthy, so everything's fine. And then think of the other very, very topical issue that we have in the financial sector, particularly in banking and money service businesses. It's the whole argument around de-risking. There's a bias there in de-risking because you get bias in the fact that, well, banks are saying we don't want a bank. If you bank, we won't be your correspondent bank if you have any money service businesses. That's putting all in a big bucket and say they're too risky. So bias, the decision making, and it could be subject to bias. And if management doesn't get to that information and review and say, well, what are the, and this goes back to this level of management information, is what information are you actually giving to senior management and the board when we really look at SARs and how they've been reported? Because not only are you looking at SARs, you want to examine which ones have been turned aside, if they're internal SARs but haven't been presented.
Right.
So, you know, is there any bias in there that says, well, 10 of them come from, you know, wealthy people who self-made men in our community? And please, if you're in a large place, my experience, particularly in banking, when I worked in London, you think of London as a huge place, but it was full of small villages, in effect. And you know, so you had a group of people who knew everybody. They all came particularly in the old days of banking, they all came into the same branch, and whether you were in a big city, but it was like a village, or whether you were in a real village, you knew everybody, and that bias can influence it. So that's where that supervision has to get to understand what are the reasons around these decisions, how well are the decisions, how well are they being made.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. The only thing I would kind of add to that is, and I can remember back in my days as an MLRO, it was sometimes people were submitting a internal SAR when really what they were wanting to do was just escalate the client, or maybe make them a little bit higher risk, and they just didn't know how to go about the process. And you know, they're kind of saying, okay, I couldn't you know, get a clear picture of the client with just this due diligence. And so, you know, my response was, well, then let's, you know, get more enhanced due diligence, you know, so we can get a clearer picture before we decide if it's suspicious activity or not, or if it's just still just not enough due diligence on the client. So that was just kind of my experience.
Let me just follow up on that. That's an excellent point, Kimberly, in the MLRO's position and senior management. When you're looking for this type of management information you want, it should be aligned to the risk ratings you've got. Because just supposing you get a situation where a series of SARs over a period of time, again, it's not just one example, but over a sample over a period of time, a lot of SARs have been put forward internally, then put forward externally, and they're all marked as low risk. Well, management need to think about, what does that mean? Is it either the SAR is a little bit, you know, not researched well enough? Alternatively, and more worrying, is it the risk ratings that are not working well? Because if you're having to put forward, you know, when you look at a batch of them, does it tell you anything to say that, you know, well, we think they're low risk, but there's too many of them have activity that we're not very comfortable with?
Right. Now, yesterday, again during our practice, you mentioned too about predicate crimes and how you felt more people needed to be aware of the predicate crimes um, for suspicious activity. Can you expand on that a little bit? Should
Yeah,
that be
well,
the people filing the internal SROs, I mean SARs? So like all staff should be kind of understanding of predicate crimes, or does that just need to be the MLRO when they're submitting the SAR that they're explaining what the suspected predicate crime is?
yeah, well, as you know, the training requirements are that they should be job specific. So there should be an understanding at any level if you're involved and you're in an area of likelihood of having to file internal SARs. So if you're a teller, you will be more familiar with the people who come in with a lot of cash who won't tell you things and whatever, or keep coming in, or the structuring approach, or the inquiry that, well, what level do you have to report anywhere else, etc., etc. So in every job that you're doing in there, and you think of that, and let's not forget non-bank. If you're forming companies, you will get certain. You need to know certain things depending upon your job function. The MLRO is really looking and saying, well, what are the facts telling me? This is unusual. What's this? And I think we all know that the heading of the Financial Action Task Force is becoming more and more in providing us with information in types of typologies that we think would never happen here, like wildlife trading,
Right.
right? And you would say, well, that's not us. We've got no wildlife, right? But the point is, giving the example of the company formation agent, that what the criminals are doing, they're forming companies to hide their items. So if they're forming a company and they're dealing with, let's say, simply speaking, with and getting wire transfers into from Africa, from African countries. So does that, that begins to say, well, that's a possibility, because the criminals are not, they're clever, aren't they? They need to use the benefit of a company to hide, their names. I mean, the beneficial ownership explosion is far from complete. So it's very, very common. So if the more that the MLRO can see some of the predicate, or understand the predicate crimes to that level, it would help them to look about, and it would help them give some sort of meaningful information to the FIU.
But just to clarify, you're not saying we have to know what the predicate crime is when we're submitting a SAR. We just kind of have to say there's these suspicious activities going on with our client that don't add up. Is that, but we don't have to know the predicate crime, or do you think it would help the SARs?
I think it would help if you had an understanding, if you thought, well, why is this happening? But no, you're absolutely right. We're not saying that the SAR, my way of looking at it, submitting a SAR, is it's unexplained wealth. How has this person got sufficient funds to do what he wants to do? Like a real estate person would be, okay, they're required to comply, or most of the jurisdictions have a legislation like that. Real estate person has to say, well, can this man does he really have a sort of lifestyle and a background that would say he could buy $1 million property? So, and that's your next thing. Now, conversely, in some areas you might see certain transactions, but remember that suspicious activity reporting is about activity, so you're seeing things, and if it's good, why would a certain client be getting wire transfers from out there out? And that's where your suspicion might come in. Well, is it going to be involved in human trafficking from other parts of the world or whatever? But that should not stop the SAR. The SAR is about this unexplained wealth. He can't tell you the story. That's the vulnerability of the criminal when they're sitting in front of you as a member of the financial business. They have to explain how they can do support these financial businesses, financial transactions. So they're saying, well, okay, where it's vulnerable is if you collect money and are buying a property or something, and you've just inherited money from a family bereavement or you've sold your business, there's always an audit trail, isn't there? You don't prove a will without going through the courts. You don't sell a business for millions without a lot of help from professionals.
Right.
So, but of course, the man who's collecting drug money or whatever, he can't give you any evidence, and
Right.
that's where the vulnerability is.
Right. I actually have a kind of interesting experience on again when I was in MLRO, and the due diligence actually came back complete. I could have easily ticked it off and everything was fine, including the source of wealth. But it was when I went to try and verify it, publicly verify it, and I couldn't. And in that research, it kind of linked to, wait a second, if this person does have as much money as they're supposed to have, you would find information about them on the, kind of maybe the website, such as, their list of board of directors, on financial statements, of the companies, that they're on the board, yet they weren't being shown as being a board member of these companies publicly. And of course, I was also kind of thinking, normally people who have that kind of wealth, they would be donating to charities and be written about. And there was just nothing. It was just quiet. And that was kind of it was also just not so much what I had or the lack of information of what I had on file. It was what I couldn't verify, out in the world, on the internet, on different websites, and that just didn't add up to me. So it wasn't so much that it was unexplained wealth, it was explained wealth, but I couldn't verify it. I mean, that was a really hard one for me.
You make a good point, don't you? In my use of the words unexplained wealth, it could be just simply unverified. And this takes us full circle to think of the customer due diligence point that you go through, and that risk assessment is so fundamentally important, because you do the risk assessment and you're picking up these characteristics, and you do get to the stage when, like we're going back to the point where everybody knows he has money. You do get the stage, well, at what stage do I want to verify this? And that's, because if you think about it, there are so many people in financial businesses are the gatekeepers, certainly lawyers and real estate and whatever. They're the ones who, the first point of call if they're criminals wanting to do something. And so they say, sooner or later, the guy says, well, yeah, I just told them I've sold my business and I've got $5 million here. And you think, well, that was easy. That's all I had to do was tell them, and they believe me.
Yeah.
Whereas at some stage, and let's be realistic, you can't say that you've got, you've got to look at the whole thing and make that judgment call and say, well, do we feel that verification is necessary? I would personally say, in most cases, there should be some verification. But it's how deep you go is dependent upon really on your judgment. But that's exactly what they will be looking for when you're supervising the MLRO decision making.
Okay. All right. Fantastic. I just want to kind of move on. We're getting up to about 20 minutes to the hour. So one slide after our discussion yesterday. So we were talking about what could be, because I remember when I was at MLRO, I think, if I recall correctly, and it was 10 years ago, so things could have changed by now. But I do remember it was something like, just yes, I filed a SAR on such and such date. I don't recall giving any meaningful information to management, and of course, now being a business owner myself, I realize the reason why you want to give information to management is so that they can do something with it. And so after our conversation yesterday, I was like, if I was back in that role, what kind of reporting format would I want to use to give to my management? So I kind of came up with this, and this little format, such as when it was internally submitted, and of course the investigation process, that review process that they used or I would have used, my conclusion. But then I was thinking, well, what else does management need to know? And so then I added, well, I think they would want to know, like, what products or services were we providing to that particular client? What due diligence method did we use to onboard them? What risk rating did we assign, which is something that you had kind of brought up. What type of client was it? Was it an individual or a corporate entity? So this is the kind of information I was kind of thinking might be useful for management, so that they could then kind of do what managers do, kind of assess. All right, what can we do to hopefully, I mean, do we need to maybe look at the different products that we're offering, and maybe limit them to only certain clients instead of making them available, that kind of information. And is something like that what you think management could also be find useful in the information that's provided to them?
Yes, definitely. I think that's a very succinct way of setting it out. My only comment would be to always remember when you're providing information to senior management or the board, that the format that you're giving the information, remember at the highest level in the board, you've really got to be told, what are the key things to worry about. So
Right.
that's a good worksheet which would demonstrate your analysis. But top it off with, well, we are worried because 10 of our recently introduced products have resulted in an uplift in SARs. So and then if you go down a bit, then management they're happy to have more detail. So just be mindful of the audience and that. But I think that's that's the worksheet, which will do for a lot of reporting. Sometimes you just need to be a bit more succinct at the highest level in the organization.
Okay. All right. We're going to take a few questions from the audience now. I can see a few of them already coming in. Okay. So if you don't mind, so we have one question. It says Turks and Caicos Islands is predominantly cash-based for execution of most transactions. We find that the cash presented may not necessarily raise a red flag. So KYC is crucial. Okay, so it doesn't seem to be a question there. She just seems to be making that statement as far as cash transactions. Somebody else is asking.
Well, actually, what you could say on that is, of course, that depends upon the business, doesn't it?
True.
On cash.
Yeah.
So that's where
I guess if I was a lawyer.
Yeah. Would they be doing that, or is it normal? I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I do have one funny kind of story about, again, when I was in London, onboarding a particular customer, and they were from a particularly high-risk jurisdiction. And before we would take their money, or start providing services, they had to go through the due diligence process. And this one actually took a couple of weeks, I remember, because certain documents were just not sufficient, and others were. So whenever I finally was able to, get them, onboarded and enough information and risk rate them, I said, okay, now you can pay your retainer of, $5,000. And I will never forget the next day I was actually at home when our office manager called me, and she goes, Kimberly, somebody dropped off an envelope with a money order made out to you for $5,000. And I was just like, no, I meant for them to pay the company, not me. So I think the person might have thought I was kind of saying, pay me and I'll clear you, but it was like, no, I can't do that. So I did find that was my only, I think it was maybe just lost in translation, but I thought that was kind of funny. All right, so somebody else is asking, once an STR, so for those who aren't familiar, that's suspicious transaction report, is filed for an individual customer, and later again, if the customer comes to the, I guess, a transaction, then do we need to file that particular transaction also as an STR? How to go about this? And I'll give you my what I think is the answer is, I think yes. If one transaction is suspicious and then another one comes in later, if that's also suspicious, I would say yes, even if it's on the same customer. I mean, is that your understanding too?
Yeah, well, that would be my advice. I think from experience, having filed an STR or SAR, the FIU, they're always open to, you're picking the phone up. They would encourage that. So in other words, do you need to go through the whole completion of that document, or do they just want to know, look, here's another recent transaction? But I definitely think they should be put in the picture, because we should always remember that in a SAR, we don't know what dots they're joining in the FIU. You know, they could be getting similar things from another financial business, you know, a few miles away or whatever, and they're just joining the dots. So I would definitely say report, but I would also say, from my experience, they are FIUs are very open, particularly when you file a SAR, to say, well, look, this is still happening, and you know, what would you like me to? How should I go about doing the picture?
Yeah. And the follow-up to that is, well, do I file the STR if that transaction is not particularly suspicious? And of course, whenever I'm thinking of transactions, I'm thinking of a bank, and usually a bank might be, you know, hey, if they come in once a month and send a wire to, you know, family, you know, you've already kind of reviewed all that and it's not suspicious, then I don't think I would file again if that was just like a normal transaction that, you know, we've seen before.
I think that's a fair point. Yeah, I think that's a fair point. But make sure that you record what's happening. You know, you've got your own file on that, so you can see. But is it a user one that you would expect? Then that's fine.
Yeah.
But don't be afraid to pick the phone up.
Absolutely. Next question is, from what point can you file an STR? Can it be filed before the transaction or if the transaction has not concluded? It's an interesting one.
I would say you whatever you find out that you think is sufficiently worrisome that it should be suspicious, you have to report. I mean, it's a classic case that you interview a customer and you start talking about this, and then you're quite clear that you don't like the sound of this. You know, he's telling all these facts, and you just think, well, this can't all be true, and I don't like the sound of it. And you don't do the business. You should report. The legislation will say that you should report, even though you don't take on the business. Now, there's a difference in reality. Is if he comes in the door and says, well, my name's so and so, and he looks like a non-starter, and you just show him the door. You haven't collected any information. So in reality, the FIU can't do anything with it. He doesn't even know the name, or you haven't even proven the name or anything. So you're going to get a certain way down the track. But yeah, you should. It's not a question of doing business. It's not a question of the transaction happening before you report.
Let me ask you a quick question. This is from me. And again, we had talked a little bit about red flags. Would you encourage, I'm seeing if I can ask the question correctly, would you encourage a company, and again, I come from a non-bank background, and I think that's so much harder because we don't have the accounts and the financial flows and where the money's coming from and things like that. It's hard on the non-bank side to determine what's suspicious. But would you say if this is a red flag, staff should automatically report it to the MLRO? And one example I will use is, again, coming from a non-bank, it was the last minute instructions, or a last minute change. It's like we onboarded the client thinking we were going to do XYZ Z for them. But then as soon as they got through the onboarding process and were cleared as a client, and then suddenly those instructions would change. They go, oh, wait a second, we're going to incorporate a company, but actually that person's not going to be the shareholder. We're going to add this person instead. And to me, that was a red flag. And I would say I would want to know about that. Would you encourage people to have certain red flags, or companies to have certain red flags that get automatically reported to the MLRO?
In my feeling, that if in most organizations, I would encourage the internal SARs, because I think this is all about the education process, really. Is that I would encourage that because the MLRO sort of relies upon the other staff there to send them internal SARs. So if there's a red flag and they think that there should be a reason, that the MLRO might come with that greater level of experience in understanding the transaction and say, well, we know why they're pressing hard. Or, so I would rather get the information in the hands of the MLRO. I think over time, then they might get a stage when you're saying, well, okay, these sort of transactions are not routinely, because we know that red flags are only red flags. And it's just so, but rather than ask people to make that interpretation, I would just say, if I was MLRO, I'd ask them to report it.
Okay.
There's no harm in reporting.
Okay. All right, we've got another question from the audience. She goes, what would you suggest is the best way forward if there is limited guidance in your jurisdiction with regard to when source of funds should be obtained?
Yeah. Well, okay. What's the way that the problem is, I think it's an excellent question, one often asked. You know, when do you do enhanced due diligence? When do you follow these steps? It's not an absolute, but go back to the risk assessment and what are your concerns on the risk assessment? Put it in the context, and then it is really a judgment call as to whether we should verify. I think that was the number of the question, really, whether you should go and get source of funds and find out, because I still think that in the context of the transaction, you should be persuaded to verify far more times. Those of you who work in the bank, in banking, what I can tell you from my experience, particularly when I saw when I was an inspector here and I would go to all the different branches, there was this famous thing about the job letter. Somebody wanted to open a current account, you had to have a job letter, you know, they'd say from your employer how much you're going to get. And I always used to think, well, this is a bit routine in some ways, because if someone's going to pay the salary into your account every month, then you can see that where they're getting it from and such like. But that's verification as a matter of routine. And then, or do you know, if people can come in and say, well, I'm going to buy a house and it's going to cost, you know, $1 million, and they don't even ask. So it is a judgment call, but it's good practice to be curious. That's where we need to be in the AML space. Be curious.
Okay. All right. And there just seems to be
but I hope I've just tried to get the temperature there. Be curious.
Yeah. Okay. The only other comment is kind of a follow-up to, like, when should somebody file an STR, you know, before or once the transaction's been done. And again, it looks like he's just kind of saying, in the meantime, compliance can be investigating the matter. And so again, I think I agree with you. Go back to, you know, file it as soon as, you know, that, you know, you have a suspicion. So, as he states, the compliance team
absolutely,
can
because some countries will have legislation where they call these consent SARs, where they may well, the FIU may well say, don't do the transaction. And that, when in practical terms, and Kimberly, you and I talked about that yesterday, it's very difficult to say it was an outgoing wire or an incoming wire that the customer is desperate for, and you're saying there's only so many times you can say you've lost the file while you're waiting for the FIU to give you consent.
I remember that was a struggle for me as well, was holding the client back until, I think, if I recall, I think it was either 3 or 7 days that we had to wait. And if we didn't hear back from the FIU, then we could proceed with the transaction. And I can remember that was very hard to manage without tipping off. But again, that's a whole nother discussion for another time.
It's a real challenge. Yes.
Yeah. So we're 5 minutes to the hour. You know, Paul, you want to give us a chance to just kind of let's just wrap it up, and then I will have one more poll question before we finish. You know, kind of what we've seemed to maybe come to a conclusion today.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I have 3 thoughts in my mind about this that I'd like to say to you. That I'd like to say to the audience, really. That remember, management information does not expect zero tolerance. And then, you know, we talk about this in the AML space. Is that, look, one mistake or one piece of activity is not, well, I must report that or whatever. You can, you know, management information should not react just when they see one situation. If you had, like, an auditor might have, you know, 300 in a sample, and they get one, they see one that's not quite right or could be improved. Right. You know, so there's not zero tolerance. I mean, money laundering is going to go on. The other point is, and I've heard this, and I think this develops a reluctance to file SARs, is suspicious activity does not mean a failure in CDD, in customer due diligence. It does not routinely mean it. In fact, in truth, the more likely reason is that it's good CDD, because you've got enough about the information about the client that you can say, well, this is unusual. So nobody's going to say to you, why did you take this client on? Because now you're reporting a SAR.
Right. No,
So
I agree with you on that. The better, I mean, I find it's the lack of CDD is when you don't file any SARs.
Yes. Well, that's the other point. You're scratching around trying to find the information, but it should not say, well, the regulator is going to come to me and say, look, you didn't take any. The CDDs was perfect, but why did it go wrong? Well, these criminals are good. And the final point I would say to all MLROs is, remember, what do the facts tell you? You're making a judgment call, but what are the facts? And this goes back to the independence of the MLRO, where the manager will say, or the board director will say, well, I know him, I play golf with him, or whatever. And you say, well, yeah, but I've got all this information. And he can see, so you say you report. So you report, that's your judgment based upon the information that you have. But I would honestly say you document that rationale, whichever way you decide. Make sure you document it, so you can say, well, I saw 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and yes, I reported it. Or I saw 5, 6, 7, 8, and I didn't feel it was necessary to report. There's a rationale, and that's the best way that management can be comfortable. There's a thought process.
Okay.
My 3 points.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Paul. And I'm going to thank everybody else for listening. We have one more poll question, and then we're going to wrap up. So really, I just wanted to find out, kind of get the pulse of the room. Did you find this past hour useful for you? I hope you did, but this does also help us. I also wanted to point out that this is Paul's website, Coleman on Compliance. He's based in Turks and Caicos, but I believe you work pretty much anywhere in the Caribbean. Is that correct? Via Zoom.
That's right.
Is that correct,
yes.
Paul?
Yep.
All right. Fantastic. And that you are providing some compliance mentoring. And I put 40 minutes, 6 sessions, but I don't know if that was what your kind of your offering is. I did, you mentioned about 1 20-minute, initial call just to kind of assess if the mentoring is good or, or needed. But I do find, I love that idea of compliance mentoring versus consulting, because especially for the smaller firms, most MLROs I find and compliance officers, compliance is not their only job. They usually have another job, and compliance is just kind of like, oh, you're going to handle this. And they may not necessarily be compliance trained or from a compliance background. And I can find the mentoring, I need somebody I can pick up the phone to and talk to about this question I have. I don't necessarily want to outsource the writing of manuals and things like that. I just need somebody to talk to. So I love the mentoring idea, Paul. I think it's a great idea. Did you want to maybe explain a little bit further about
Yes.
the mentoring process?
Thanks, Kimberly. Yeah, this is a service that I'm just launching now, and it's, as Kimberly described, well, it's more like, well, if there's 6 sessions, say over 6 months or 5 months or whatever, we just do 40 minutes and we just chat about what's on your mind. Very similar to how Kimberly and I have talked now. We're just backwards and forwards, and what does this mean? I've always wondered about that. And we just chat, and then I can say, well, I found this useful. You can say, well, I've worked this out. This is how I've for example, like the reporting document you had for the suspicious activity, are we telling the right things? And same discussion. And I would say that this would apply to MLROs and MLCOs. Some people do that job jointly. Some people are just an MLCO when you're going in compliance officer. I think, there's all sorts of things that compliance officers have to think about, how to do their quarterly reports and what to tell them, what to say and such. So it's that. We'll have a quick chat. For 20 minutes, that's free, free, complimentary, and just to see where your position is in the business, whether I think it would be worth And what I'm going to do is, as Kimberly said, if you can contact me through the website, mention that you've been on this call, and we'll do a discounted price for the sessions, and we'll work around that. So I'm very keen to get this going, and I think the interaction would be, I know from a receiving end, be very good.
Yeah, I think it's a great idea. And as from our poll results, 94% did say they found this past hour useful. And I think of this Gray Matters webinar as a little bit like that mentoring, again, where you're just kind of addressing and discussing some of the more difficult aspects of AML compliance. So we're going to, wrap up here because we are right at 10 o'clock at the on the hour. So our next webinar for Gray Matters is to be determined. So I'm looking for good guests and good topics. So please feel free to reach out to me. And there is another event I wanted to tell the audience about. BDO and the Cayman Islands are hosting a virtual compliance AML and financial crime conference. It's October 20th. I should know that because I'm going to be one of the presenters. I'm going to be talking on source of wealth and funds in one of the workshops. There are some very, very good workshops, and they are offering 3 continuing education credits as well. So if you are trying to get your education credits wrapped up by the end of the year, that's a good one, and it's fairly affordable. And there's, like I said, excellent speakers on China, policy management, tech trends as well. So please do look it up. You can just Google BDO Cayman events. It should come up. But it's the Anti-Money Laundering and Financial Crime Prevention Virtual Conference, October 20th, and you get 3 education credits. Okay. Well, again, thank you, everybody. This broadcast has been recorded, and it will be available. We usually send it out the next day with copies of slides. And again, thank you so much for joining us today, and I hope to see you at future Gray Matters webinars. And Paul, thank you again so much for your time today and your experience and your wisdom. I always enjoy talking to you. Again, we can talk for hours, and I learned so much whenever I do talk from you and learn from your experience. So thank you very, very much for taking the time today, and I do hope you get a few people taking you up on your offer of mentoring.
Well, thank you very much, everybody, for taking the time out to listen, and I'm very gratified and humbled, really, with the response. So thank you that you felt 94% felt it was helpful. Thank you, Kimberly, for the opportunity, and we'll talk again. But thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Paul, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Good morning, everyone.